Brother convinced my parents I was on drugs to get my trust fund. The hair follicle test results shocked everyone. Everything started falling apart when I turned 25 last March. That's when I was supposed to get access to my trust fund, the one my grandparents set up before they died. The amount wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to help me buy a house and maybe start something of my own. I'd been looking forward to it for years, especially since I'd been working dead-end jobs and barely scraping by while my older brother seemed to have everything handed to him. My parents called me over for dinner that Sunday, and I knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. My mom couldn't look me in the eye, and my dad kept clearing his throat like he was about to give a speech. My brother was there too, sitting at the table with this weird expression I couldn't quite read. He kept glancing at me and then looking away like he was nervous about something. When my dad finally spoke up, he said they'd been having concerns about my behavior lately. He mentioned that I'd been looking tired, that my eyes seemed different, and that I'd been acting strange during family gatherings. My mom chimed in about how I'd been forgetting things and showing up late to events. They said my brother had expressed some worries about me, and after talking it over, they decided to hold off on releasing the trust fund until I could prove I was clean. I sat there completely stunned. I'd never touched drugs in my life, not even marijuana. Sure, I'd been tired lately, but I'd been working 2 jobs to make ends meet while also taking night classes. Of course I looked exhausted. And yes, I'd been forgetting some family stuff, but that was because I had so much on my plate, not because I was high. I looked at my brother, expecting him to back me up, but he just sat there nodding along with everything my parents were saying. When I directly asked him what he'd told them, he started listing off all these incidents that either never happened or were completely twisted versions of normal things. He claimed he'd seen me acting erratic at my cousin's wedding, that I'd been slurring my words during phone calls, and that I'd asked him weird questions about money that made him suspicious. The worst part was how convinced my parents were. They'd already made up their minds before I even walked in the door. When I tried to defend myself, they just looked at me like I was lying, like I was exactly the kind of person who would be in denial about a drug problem. My mom actually started crying and said she just wanted her son back. I demanded they get me drug tested right then and there. I was so angry and hurt that I was willing to do anything to prove them wrong. But my dad said they'd already looked into it, and apparently my brother had told them that most drugs leave your system quickly, so a standard test wouldn't be reliable. He said they wanted to wait and see if I'd be willing to get clean first. That's when I realized how calculated this whole thing was. My brother had clearly done his research and was trying to create a situation where I couldn't immediately prove my innocence. The more I protested, the more it probably looked like the desperate denials of someone with a problem. I left that dinner feeling like my whole world had been turned upside down. These were the people who were supposed to know me better than anyone, and they'd been convinced by my own brother that I was some kind of drug addict. The trust fund was locked away, and I was being treated like I was mentally incompetent. Over the next few weeks, things got even worse. My brother started showing up at my apartment unannounced, claiming he was checking on me. He'd look around like he was searching for evidence, and he'd ask my neighbors if they'd noticed anything unusual about my behavior. He was basically conducting his own investigation to build a case against me. My parents started calling me multiple times a day, asking how I was feeling and if I was ready to get help. They'd analyze everything I said for signs that I was under the influence. If I sounded happy, I was probably on something. If I sounded tired, I was probably coming down from something. It was like being under a microscope, and it was driving me crazy. The really messed up part was that my brother started positioning himself as the responsible one who was looking out for everyone's best interests. He'd have long conversations with my parents about how worried he was about me, and he'd volunteer to handle family responsibilities that I'd normally be involved in. He was essentially taking over my role in the family while I was being treated like the family disappointment. I tried reaching out to other family members, but my brother had gotten there first. He'd already told them about my supposed drug problem, and most of them were keeping their distance. A few of my cousins were sympathetic, but they didn't want to get involved in family drama, especially when it involved accusations about drugs. The isolation was terrible. I'd gone from being a normal member of the family to being the person everyone whispered about and worried over. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where people would watch me carefully and make comments about how I looked healthier or more alert than before, as if they were monitoring my recovery from an addiction I never had. After about a month of this nightmare, I decided I needed to take drastic action. I started researching drug tests and learned about hair follicle testing, which can detect drug use going back several months. If I could pass one of those tests, there would be no way anyone could claim I was using drugs or had been using them recently. I made an appointment at a private testing facility and paid for the most comprehensive hair follicle test they offered. I wanted to test for everything: cocaine, marijuana, opiates, amphetamines, everything they could possibly test for. I was determined to get results that would be so clear and undeniable that my family would have to face the truth. The wait for the results was agonizing. I kept thinking about how my brother would react when he was proven wrong and how my parents would feel when they realized they'd been manipulated. I was angry, but I was also sad about how much damage had already been done to our relationships. When I got the call that my results were ready, I immediately drove to the testing center. The technician handed me the report and I scanned it quickly, looking for the bottom line. Clean. Completely clean. No trace of any drugs whatsoever. I was relieved, but I was also furious. This piece of paper proved that my brother had been lying about me for weeks, that my parents had been manipulated into believing something that wasn't true, and that I'd been put through emotional hell for no reason. I made copies of the results and drove straight to my parents' house. I walked in and slammed the report down on the kitchen table where they were eating lunch. I told them to read it carefully and then explained to me how their drug-addicted son had managed to pass a test that would have caught any drug use from the past several months. My parents looked shocked as they read through the results. My mom kept flipping through the pages like she was looking for something that might contradict what she was seeing. My dad just sat there staring at the paper with this expression I'd never seen before. But the biggest shock was my brother's reaction. Instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, he looked angry. He actually grabbed the report and started questioning its validity. He asked if I'd somehow cheated or if the testing facility was legitimate. He suggested that maybe I'd been using drugs that weren't included in the test. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about him being concerned about me or even about him wanting the trust fund money. He was genuinely angry that his plan hadn't worked, and he was still trying to find ways to discredit me even when faced with scientific evidence. My parents, on the other hand, were starting to look at my brother differently. My mom asked him directly what had made him think I was using drugs, and he started repeating the same vague stories he'd told before. But now, with the test results in front of them, those stories sounded a lot less convincing. My dad asked me to walk him through everything that had happened over the past month, and I told him about my brother's unexpected visits, his conversations with the neighbors, and his efforts to position himself as the family's responsible son. As I was talking, I could see my parents putting the pieces together. The real turning point came when my mom called my brother out on something specific. She asked him about the time he'd claimed to see me acting erratic at the wedding, and she pointed out that he'd left the wedding early and couldn't have seen me during the time he was describing. When he tried to backtrack and change his story, she got this look on her face like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. My dad was quiet for a long time, and then he asked my brother if he'd been lying about me using drugs. My brother got defensive and started talking about how he'd been genuinely concerned and how he'd rather be wrong about something like this than ignore a potential problem. But his explanation sounded hollow, especially since he'd been so insistent about details that were now being proven false. The conversation got heated and my brother eventually stormed out of the house. Before he left, he made some comment about how I'd always been the favorite and how nothing he did ever mattered to anyone. It was like he was finally admitting that this whole thing had been motivated by jealousy and resentment rather than genuine concern. After he left, my parents and I had a long talk. They apologized for not believing me, and they admitted that they'd been so focused on the possibility that I might have a problem that they hadn't really considered the possibility that my brother might be lying. They'd known him his whole life, and it had never occurred to them that he'd be capable of something like this. My mom was especially upset. She kept saying she should have known better, that she should have trusted her own instincts about me. She'd apparently had doubts about some of my brother's stories, but she'd pushed those doubts aside because she'd thought it was important to take any concerns about drug use seriously. My dad was more angry than sad. He felt like my brother had manipulated them and made them complicit in treating me unfairly. He was also concerned about what this meant for our family going forward, since it was clear that my brother had been willing to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. We talked about the trust fund, and my parents said they'd start the process of releasing it to me immediately. They also said they wanted to make sure I understood that they'd never doubted my character or my integrity. They'd just been scared and confused by the stories they'd been hearing. But the damage was already done in a lot of ways. I'd spent weeks feeling like an outsider in my own family, and I'd lost trust in people who were supposed to have my back no matter what. Even though my parents were apologizing and trying to make things right, I couldn't just forget how quickly they'd been willing to believe the worst about me. The situation with my brother became really complicated after that. He avoided family gatherings for a while, and when he did show up, there was this tension that everyone could feel. My parents tried to act normal around him, but I could tell they were seeing him differently now. A few weeks later, my brother reached out to me directly. He wanted to meet for coffee to talk about what had happened. I almost said no, but I was curious about what he might say, so I agreed to meet him. When we sat down, he didn't apologize right away. Instead, he started talking about how he'd felt overlooked and undervalued by the family for years. He said he'd worked hard to be responsible and reliable, but that I'd always been the one who got attention and support. He mentioned specific instances where he felt like our parents had favored me going back to when we were kids. Some of what he said wasn't entirely wrong. I probably had gotten more attention in some ways, and our parents had definitely been more lenient with me about certain things. But I couldn't understand how that justified what he'd done to me. When I pointed out that he'd lied about me using drugs and had tried to manipulate our parents into withholding my inheritance, he got defensive again. He said he'd convinced himself that I probably was using drugs because I'd been acting differently and that he'd just been trying to protect the family's interests. It was clear that he'd created this narrative in his head where he was the victim and I was the problem, even though he'd been the one doing the lying and manipulating. He seemed to genuinely believe that his actions had been justified, which made it even harder for me to figure out how to move forward with him. The conversation didn't go well. He never really took full responsibility for what he'd done, and he kept trying to make it sound like a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate attempt to sabotage me. By the time we left the coffee shop, I felt like I understood him better, but I also felt like our relationship might be permanently damaged. The trust fund situation got resolved pretty quickly after that. My parents fast-tracked the release process and I had access to the money within a couple of weeks. It was a relief to finally have that financial security, but it felt bittersweet given everything that had happened. I used some of the money to move to a different part of town, partly because I wanted a fresh start and partly because I needed some distance from the whole situation. I also started thinking more seriously about what I wanted to do with my life, since the drama with my family had made me realize how much I'd been drifting without clear goals. My relationship with my parents slowly improved over the following months. They made an effort to check in with me regularly and to include me in family decisions, and I could tell they were trying to make up for how they treated me. But there were still moments when I'd catch them looking at me with this expression of guilt or regret, like they were still processing what had happened. The hardest part was family gatherings where my brother was present. Everyone would try to act normal, but there was always this underlying tension. My brother would make efforts to be friendly with me, but it felt forced and awkward. Other family members could sense that something had changed, even if they didn't know all the details. One of the most unexpected consequences of the whole situation was that it made me more aware of family dynamics that I'd never really noticed before. I started paying attention to how my parents interacted with each of us, and I realized that my brother probably had been dealing with feelings of being overlooked for a long time. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand how he might have gotten to the point where he'd be willing to sabotage me. It also made me think about my own behavior and whether I'd been sensitive to his feelings over the years. About 6 months after everything happened, my brother and I had another conversation. This time, he was more genuinely apologetic. He said he'd been thinking about what he'd done and that he realized how wrong it had been. He didn't try to justify his actions or make excuses, which was a relief. He also told me that he'd been struggling with some personal issues that had made him more resentful and angry than usual. He didn't go into details, but he said he'd been feeling stuck in his life and had been looking for someone to blame for his problems. When the trust fund situation came up, it had seemed like an opportunity to level the playing field between us. I appreciated his honesty, but I told him that I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget. What he'd done had affected me deeply, and it was going to take time for me to trust him again. I also told him that I thought he needed to work on understanding why he'd been willing to hurt me so badly over money and jealousy. We agreed to take things slowly and to try to rebuild our relationship gradually. It wasn't going to be easy, but I felt like it was worth trying, especially for the sake of our parents and the rest of the family. The whole experience changed me in ways I'm still figuring out. I used to be pretty trusting and naive about people's motivations, but now I'm more careful about taking things at face value. I've also become more aware of how family dynamics can be complicated and how even people who love each other can hurt each other badly. On the positive side, having access to the trust fund has allowed me to make some changes in my life that I'd been putting off. I was able to quit one of my jobs and focus more on my studies, and I'm planning to use some of the money to start a small business that I've been thinking about for years. I've also become closer to some of my cousins and other family members who reached out to me after they learned what had really happened. It turns out that a few of them had their own doubts about my brother's stories, but they hadn't felt comfortable speaking up at the time. The situation with my brother is still evolving. We've had a few more conversations since his apology, and I can tell he's making an effort to be more thoughtful about how he treats me. But there's still a part of me that wonders if he might try something like this again if he feels cornered or desperate. My parents have been more supportive than I expected. They've made it clear that they regret how they handled the situation, and they've been working to rebuild trust with me. They've also been setting clearer boundaries with my brother and making sure he understands that his behavior was unacceptable. One thing that's been helpful is that I've started talking to other people who've dealt with similar family situations. It turns out that sibling rivalry and manipulation around money and inheritance is more common than I'd realized. Hearing other people's stories has helped me feel less alone and has given me some perspective on how to navigate the ongoing challenges. I'm still angry about what happened, and I don't think that anger will completely go away. But I'm also trying to focus on moving forward and building the life I want for myself. The trust fund has given me opportunities that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and I'm determined to make the most of them. Looking back, I think the whole situation was a wake-up call for our entire family. It forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our relationships and our communication patterns. It also made us realize how important it is to question assumptions and to give people the benefit of the doubt even when you're hearing concerning stories about them. The hair follicle test results were the key to proving my innocence, but they also opened up a much bigger conversation about trust, family loyalty, and what it means to really know someone. I'm grateful that I was able to clear my name, but I'm also aware that the scars from this experience will probably be with me for a long time. The most important thing I've learned is that family relationships require constant work and attention. You can't just assume that people will always have your best interests at heart even if they love you. You have to stay engaged and communicate openly, and you have to be willing to stand up for yourself when necessary. I'm still figuring out what my relationship with my brother will look like going forward, but I'm committed to being honest about my feelings and my expectations. I'm also committed to not letting this experience make me cynical about family or relationships in general. There's still love and loyalty in my family, but now I have a more realistic understanding of how complicated those things can be.